This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
We learn that people slip, it's only human. Errors show the path to grow and we're improving. Context shakes the way we do our best work. Focus on the system, no blame can hold us back. 5 HOP principles lifting us higher. Learning without blame, fueling our fire. Together we grow, together we thrive. Keeping operational excellence alive.
Hi listeners, this is Brent Sutton. Welcome to Season 6 and the 128th episode of the podcast show, Hop Into Action. The show is an ongoing discussion about building a better community of practice for people and organisations who want to improve safety, quality and operational excellence using HOP, learning teams, 4Ds and other learning frameworks. Today, we conclude the discussion with Ben Hutchinson. Ben is not only a seasoned senior health and safety leader, but he also has a deep interest in safety research. Ben operates the site safetyinsights.org and is the host of Safe As Podcast, where he posts and talks about safety research summaries in a way that is relatable for others to learn from. The second part of the discussion centres on current research and areas for future safety focus. So please sit back and enjoy this series of Hop Into Action.
Ben, part of why getting on this podcast in particular was because I really value the work that you're doing, and I want more people to be active readers and participants in that. So what's some of the interesting stuff coming up soon that you can share?
So I've gone ahead. I've recorded a whole bunch of different episodes for the Safe As podcast. I've really tried to keep it broad. I don't want to go down one particular pathway. So I've got quite a lot of the work from the Construction Safety Research Alliance in the US. So people will know it pretty well from Matthew Hallowell's work, like the statistical invalidity of TRIFA and whatnot, which we could discuss that at length. On that, they didn't actually say TRIFA was statistically invalid. You need to reread it. But they were saying the way that we actually use it is almost certainly invalid as far as drawing inferences from it, using it for decision-making, which has never been a good idea. And even Deming, literally decades ago, warned against using defects to help inform decisions was a really bad idea unless you really understood the inputs. I've got quite a few more around leadership and followership. So there's this bias, and I'm just as guilty for it, of covering sort of the Hollywood romanticized vision of leaders as, you know, heroes coming in to lead the crowd out of uncertainty. So we recorded an episode around followership. You know, to be a leader, you need someone to essentially follow. So what are the qualities of followers that typically buy into effective leadership? And what does leadership do to, I guess, corral the effective followers? I've tried to stay away from accident stuff. Now, I'll put my bias on the cards, my bias on the table. I love major disasters. I love studying accidents. I think some in our community are too anti-accidents. They're saying it's all about normal work. I think that should be the core focus of safety, is moving towards normal work. But I still think if you look at, even go to like the Hohenhagel's original arguments around the whole performance spectrum, deviations, unexpected outcomes, it's still there. And what he was arguing with the safety 2 approach is not to discard any one of them, use all of them to leverage insights.
100%.
So I've tried to limit the amount of sort of pure accident stuff, only because, even though I read a lot of it, it's already overrepresented in what we do. It's already overrepresented in everything we do. And we don't do enough of just the normal, mundane sort of day-to-day work. There's a really cool one coming up. It's based on one of my favorite articles called The Tragedy of Adaptability. So I've recorded a pod on it. Honestly, you're better off just not listening to my pod and just reading the original paper. It's only like 3 pages. But Wares and Hedinger, what they argue is that there's a tragedy of what they call the tragedy of adaptability. They say that systems look like they're really efficient and functioning only because people are filling in all the gaps under the surface.
Yep.
It's like that image of the duck. It's calm on the top, but you're under the water and its little legs are paddling like crazy. And what they say is that people, and they're talking about healthcare, which healthcare is a very challenging domain, given the sort of challenges that they face, the resource constraints, that people are essentially twisted like pretzels trying to fill the gaps. But if you're a manager and you're looking at work as prescribed, work as imagined, you go out there and have a quick look around, things look like they're operating really, really well. And that's because people are so good at adapting. They finish the design so well that you don't see all those little gaps. But over time, it pushes them to their absolute limits. So if we're talking about resilient capacities, we've absolutely exhausted all of our resilient capacities, like healthcare is the textbook example. And we put people further into a state where they either have disengagement, they have like compassion fatigue. We have issues of drift where workarounds get exceedingly more dangerous, to put it without a better word. They get closer to the margins of safety. So it's a really good paper. So that one I'm looking forward to releasing on the pod. Hopefully I've done a good job of discussing it. But yeah, the paper is just one of those things I think a lot more people should read because it gives a really good context.
That sounds exciting because, look, I know myself. I think, the pandemic really kicked the guts out of whatever resilient capacity was left. And in our last book, Volume 5, we call it Better Work, we talked about this. We talked about the fact that about tacit knowledge, and that as the workforce, the aged workforce exits, we have this thing now called green on green. So green people training green people.
Right, okay.
And all that tacit knowledge never existed in the system. So the system looked good because of that tacit knowledge. That tacit knowledge is now gone, and now all the gaps are starting to appear. And my predictor will be, on the basis of that component, that we'll see harm rates climb in those types of high-risk problem-solving type industries.
And it doesn't translate well to declared knowledge either, so that tacit knowledge.
Yeah.
It can do in some areas, but totally agree. So I saw that really prominently when I worked in utilities. So let's say you're interfacing with the public water mains and all the like trunk mains and all the feed pipes, and a lot of these date to decades like 70s and 60s. Some of them are even older than that. They didn't have good records to begin with, and they certainly don't have any better records now around those old assets. The reason why the system works most of the time is because you have these old timers that have been in like council for 30 or 40 years. Once they leave, all that tacit knowledge is gone because it hasn't translated well into documented systems.
Yeah.
Now, there are ways to help tap into that knowledge, and like Gary Klein talks a lot about how to sort of tap in and accelerate expertise, but it's just such a, to your point, it's such a brittleness within safe capacity, like safe work.
Yeah. But what terrifies me is that organizations still believe their system's strong. So when that event happens, the system, I call it the Book of Eli, they're leading with the good book and saying, why did you depart from the good book? And that's the scary part, because no one's asking the question, how was the void being filled in once you've gone through all the induction process and all these other things, because that's where all that knowledge is sort of coming out. And I was with an organization recently in Europe where they pour white metal for bearings, and they know that those guys doing that job are getting close to retirement. And for someone, because we call it's an artisan's job, it's not something you do in a procedure. It takes at least 5 years to get the feel of it because it's like an art form. And that's terrifying because the net result of that is not about harm. The net result of that is about quality. Okay, and they're looking at other types of technology that they can use to help that because they know they can't find these people because no one wants to be in that mucky job of pouring molten metal anymore.
It's a really good example. Yeah, actually, there's a real good example. So Amal Berti talks about this, like with there's a particular type of fishing. I can't remember what type of fishing it was, but like maybe it's like deep sea fishing or something, and like forestry and fishing industries. They're industries that have been artisan based, and we've tried to impose very sort of 20th century written systems on top of it. Yeah, well intentioned, of course, but it's very difficult to write up, let's say, for a forestry worker chopping down trees, to write with the same level of what we call it, like deterministic sort of procedures compared to like someone operating an industrial press or something. Like one is very clearly more amenable to writing up an SOP. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't do it, but there's some really cool research, like in the Safety 2 world, around the challenge of becoming, this is what I'm trying to get to. It's not that you can't do it. It's just that we generate a whole lot of false safety by doing it because it just doesn't represent reality. So certainly you can write up a forestry worker's task to the minute degree, but don't be surprised when someone gets killed the next day and the procedures just didn't reflect all the stuff they actually do, that variability. So I'm not saying we shouldn't try to get better at describing the types of work, but yeah, we have to respect, like you said, tacit knowledge. Like it's absolutely critical. Oh yeah. And look, I'm one of those people. I do love a good flowchart, but like my example about when I process mapped the onboarding procedure versus that should have been a simple task. That should have been a simple flowchart describing the 20 tasks from the procedure. But of course, reality is not that simple. So that's why I said to Lee, like that's a simple task, like onboarding plan. Now imagine it for some sort of complex task, not just like operating nuclear reactor, because there's no doubt there's some very precise steps you need to take. They can document tasks very well in certain areas, a lot of areas. But now you take a construction worker who has to do some reworks because they overpoured a concrete slab. Good luck trying to describe that in minute details. We need to be sensitized to the point that there's a lot more to it than these very static described systems. And the stuff that we do right, does need to be focused on the things like you talk about energy exchanges. That's a really good place for procedures to get better at, is focusing on the things that they can better control and describe, energy exchanges. And then we use other structured means and informal means to get better at the other sort of the grey areas in between, people's risk perceptions, how we respond to reworks, making decisions, frontline decision making, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, what information do they even receive? Like that's a good place to start, is investigations. I've seen this one come up quite regularly. The investigation talks about how they made a poor decision. And then you just talk to them and say, well, what information did you actually have at the time that could have helped you make a better decision? They're like, well, what I needed was X, Y, Z, but that's never existed here. And I've asked for a different information management system. I've asked for something else. They never could have succeeded even to begin with. Or they could have, but the odds were against them.
Yeah. It reminds me, I'm doing an interesting piece of work at the moment around Rasmussen's knowledge-based performance mode. We basically talked about that people, there's three elements that make up, I don't like the word mental model, but he said there's three elements that make up the picture we form to problem solve. And, one part is knowledge and beliefs. One part is how we analyze. And then the third part's how we reason with information. And even on this call today, Ben, your knowledge and beliefs different to mine. How you analyze different to mine. How you reason different to mine. Okay? And everyone's going to be different.
Yeah.
But what he was trying to say is that people need to form this picture of how they go about doing it. And in the past, we have traditionally been telling people what that picture should be. What this piece of work is, where people are doing this high risk work, we're going out and through narrative based, we're looking to see what are the elements that people do that. Because by the way, those elements sit deep psychologically, make sense? And they're actually hard for someone to express because they're more sitting in that in a school-based layer, if that makes sense. It's really hard for them to do that. And the best example I can do that, people, like if I showed you a picture of a worker on the ground injured and I gave you the words ABC, then most of us would form a picture of airway breathing and circulation. So regardless of how long ago you were trained, you would form this model in your head, and that model would assist you in how you reason and analyze situation. Doesn't assist you
heuristics.
within, correct. And as much as people give it a hard time, we're using AI to listen to those narratives and to identify those different elements. And what are we just finding? We're finding that there are shared components across workers. And what we're then forming is these mnemonics. So there's little 3 or 4 type things that we can then use with workers where they apply. They don't need to be trained because they apply it in their process. And that becomes that embedded mental model going forward. Because ultimately, people don't realize that's what the 4Ds was. The 4Ds was to form a mental model around being able to critically appraise from a worker point of view. Everyone said it, well, you've just used it to get stories out of workers. No, it was much deeper than that, because it was actually helping workers to become more curious, which goes back to your point. It was trying to tell you all the things that don't exist in a system, because it's pulling out all those other elements that have to exist to do work.
We are taking a break to share a message with you. Maybe you've heard the promises of AI and wondered, can I trust it with safety, with quality, with my data? I get it. So let me show you a real example. With Plod.ai Note Taker and HOP Copilot's field-based work insights, you can capture what's happening on the ground, worker conversations, the everyday doesn't make sense, dangerous, difficult, and different moments. These aren't polished reports. They're real voices, real insights. For instance, a team doing shift handover uses a Plod Note device. The note-taker agent listens in, captures the conversations, transcribes them, and then summarizes them under the 4Ds and 4Ls framework. It might pick up that someone said, "We didn't have enough lighting in the stairwell. We tripped over hose reels. The emergency latch isn't clear." Those get categorized. Dumb, dangerous, difficult, different. Learnings and potential improvements are surfaced. And yes, while this is AI-powered, human judgment remains central. You review, you validate, you decide. Ethical AI designed so people are always in control. On top of that, HOP Copilot agents run on Microsoft 365 Copilot, which keeps your data secure. User prompts and responses are protected. None of your internal data is used to train public models. So, for those skeptical of AI, wondering if it's hype or risk, this one turns voice into value. If you care about safety, clarity, and learning, HOP Copilot with Plod agents gives you tools like the Learning from Work Insights agent, critical control insights, work design, and error trap analysis. Here's what you can do. Visit hopcopilot.com. Explore the Plod note-taker agents. Try the free version of the Event Learning Storyboard, or book a chat with us about bringing the full suite into your team. Let's build safer, smarter work together, where AI serves humans, not the other way around. Now back to the podcast.
So Don Norman spoke about this quite a bit in his work. So Don Norman's most famous for the Norman doors, which he actually joked about. He's most famous for the things that don't represent his work the best. Like, he talks about having good human-centered design, but the Norman doors are like the crummiest sort of doors. Anyway, he talks about this quite a bit around mental models. I actually do like the term mental models, but I saw Dave Snowden recently doesn't like the idea of the brain using models. In any case, Don Norman spoke about quite a bit around, we create these systems that don't make it really easy for us to have a really good understanding of the system and its functionality, what it does. He talks about, affordances and signifiers. So we have these mismatches between our mental model and the actual operating system itself, the model. And there's some really cool things we can do. There's all the design stuff you can do. So the door is the best example, like the Norman door. If you want someone to push a door, you have a flat panel. If you want them to pull, you have a handle. We can do more of that in workplace design. And it's not just for physical designing plant, like changing the color of things. So if something's like, you can use priming and colors, you can use visual sort of, but people do become normalized to it. Yeah, it is. Yeah. And like red's very visceral for people. The other one is there's this cool stream of research. So you mentioned around using heuristics. There's this stream of research around fast and frugal heuristics. And I've used something similar around, let's say that we have people operating near mobile plants. Let's say it's on the tracks, on a railway tracks, and we need them to apply like a 3-meter exclusion zone with pedestrians. We need them to move the boom into the center of the plant so other plant can drive past. You can either drill all these rules into people, which you could try. Another tool is using heuristics. You give people really quick sorts of rules of thumb to use. So there's this idea of the rule of 3. Very simple heuristic. If you have, let's say, 3 greens, like 3 things that meet the sort of successful criteria, you go ahead. If you have 1 red, you stop. If you have 2 ambers, you stop and think, like consider, unpack. It doesn't always work, but you give people real tools they can use, like sort of rough and nasty field tools. So we did something similar around mobile plant, a bit of a quick mnemonic. And I can't remember what the mnemonic was. Let's say it was miss or speed. And one is whatever the word is, 3-meter exclusion, or it's 3 miss or something like that. It doesn't fit every circumstance, but you give people tools that they can apply in the field to help improve decisions when we want them to improve. Because they're not going to go to a 30-page standard every time, if ever. But if you give them a real quick mnemonic, the word 3 miss, that's a made-up one, but it's something like one of those, and each word letter means, like stop the plant, move the boom, 3-meter exclusion. And your point around the AI is we did something similar actually using software where you record your pre-starts and your observations. Now, this isn't just to sort of track from a sort of legal butt covering sort of exercise, but if you want to understand people's worldview around how they actually talk about something, how do our supervisors talk about vehicle interactions? And you could roll out a toolbox to measure it, and you can start clustering that. So it turns out, let's say, I'll make this up, but let's say we have an issue with people entering exclusion zones. So we've tracked the workplace observations, the pre-starts, whatever it is. Tracking is a bad word. It sounds very surveillance-y, but it turns out when you start doing the narrative mapping, sort of build heat maps, 60% of discussions over a month are cynical about the exclusion zones. People say they just don't work. Suddenly you've got a huge amount of intel. Whether you agree with it or not, it doesn't matter. That's what people are saying. And language creates worlds, It gives you so many insights to follow up on. So you go out there and talk with people. Why is it that you think that the 3-meter exclusion zone doesn't work? And they'll say, well, actually, because the plant has to operate next to another piece of plant and it's only 1.5 meters. So how do we do it? Like those sort of things.
And I 100% agree, because that's, start with knowledge and beliefs, move into, reasoning. We came up with a name because we can't use the word mental model because it forms a certain picture. We actually just called it applied reasoning tool. And once again, it's that same catchiness. But what was interesting is part of it also was that when these events happened, okay, whether it was a good or bad, a debrief was essential, because what we found is that when things went bad and they were investigated, it actually undermined the mental model, which actually made the person feel worse. So as part of that debrief process, what we've been getting them to do is ask them questions like, so in that situation, what surprised you? What was different from what you expected? So the whole approach we've been looking at it is, how do we actually deepen the mental model rather than undermine it? Because I got to tell you, investigations undermine them. because you're asking about the person's decision making rather than what was the framing. And I go back that classic Todd comment: did the worker make a bad choice, or did they only have bad choices to make? And that's the type of thing we're trying to really get into. What are those things? Because they're not sitting there with a list of 10 options and saying, here's the one I'm going to choose.
Yeah. So Gary Klein talks about this around, we almost never use analytical methods. We don't weigh up all the choices. We satisfy. We find the first appropriate, sufficient pattern match. So I agree. And the investigations, I think some in our community are too anti-investigation. I think they are still useful. I think you can do better stuff with them. You can inject better thinking. But but I think one of the key limitations, I think sometimes, maybe not every time, I already mentioned this, the investigations get you focusing on yesterday's events so in such details. Like we're taking tape measures for things, and we haven't actually got better at understanding the task and understanding things related to that task, the things that supported it. We don't necessarily know any better. How does the task normally get done? Like that's not even asked in every investigation. Like, how did they do the task last week? Is it the same? When was the last time they worked around the process? What does good look like? Like, it's just such sometimes a wasted sort of opportunity to get people together. And I think that's one of the limitations of using like fixed sort of structures. But I guess contradictorily, I'm going to contradict myself here and say, I do think that debriefs can be more insightful when they do have more of a structure to them, a structure or semi-structured approach. So certainly informal, very useful for stuff. I covered it on the podcast recently around a safety 2 inspired debrief. Nothing really earth-shattering as far as the questions, very sort of standard sort of safety 2-y human factors inspired. But the point is some of these insights don't naturally flow out unless you actually probe for them. Sometimes they will. But to your point, like it is useful at times to actually ask those questions. And I love the question of surprise. I ask it all the time. I've actually put it into our critical control like verifications I've even tried to put into board reports, getting the leaders to say, does any of this surprise you? But surprise is just such a great, powerful question when you're unpacking.
The thing is, it's the thing you can remember. So the example I was saying to someone the other day, because they're saying, if a worker is truly operating in skill mode, meaning muscle memory, okay, they have no recollection of what they were doing until something changed.
Yeah, it's like when you drive to work, you have no recollection of
But all listeners, please report an unsafe act if you've lost time of journey and because you've lost situational awareness. You weren't paying attention on the road. But if we fixate on that, we're asking the workers to reconstruct something that may not have been true. But what they will know is what changed or what surprised them. And I think that's the whole thing. That's the thing in your head. That's the thing you'll know. Okay, and you've probably got some memory about how you then responded in that situation. And I wonder how often sometimes our traditional approaches to these things that we're actually forcing hindsight to become a negative experience rather than a learning experience, because they're asking people to judge their own actions in hindsight when they actually can't recall what they're actually doing.
So there are better ways to do that, but like the critical recall method, I've covered that on my pod also. This has been used for decades, particularly in healthcare and other sort of industries. Now, the critical decision method does help unpack people's decisions at the time. What were your goals at the time? What were you thinking about? What did you observe? What was different? What surprised you? But to your point, the further away you do it from the task, the more construction you have. Because memory isn't like a VHS. It's not just recording stuff. It's absolutely interpretive, constructive process. And in fact, there's a really cool podcast on Have You Been Paying Attention? That's the TV show. You're Not So Smart. In fact, I just reconstructed something right then. You're Not So Smart. Now, on You're Not So Smart, there was a researcher that shows just how fickle memories are too. Like they were able to get people to reconstruct stuff that didn't happen. As far as they had people join a study, the participants provided their parents' details, so the researchers could talk to their parents, And they said, oh, when your child was 12, did they ever get arrested? The parent was, no, of course not. And then, knowing that information, they put that to the actual participants. They said, oh, can you tell me about that time you were 10 where you nearly got arrested? And quite a few of these participants would be like, oh yeah, actually I remember that. Yeah, they weren't lying, like, because memory is reconstructive. It tastes feelings, and memory is a very fickle thing. Very useful for what ifs and counterfactuals, but
bad on the other side, absolutely.
Bad on the other stuff, yeah.
So Ben, thank you so much for your time today. So Ben's website is safetyinsights.org, and your podcast is available on all the great channels, Apple, Spotify, etc. Really looking forward to all that, you carrying on that work. And, I highly recommend to all the listeners to get on there and listen to some of these episodes, because at the end of the day, the more curious we can be, the more we'll learn. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for joining me on this journey with Hop Into Action. I've loved sharing stories, ideas, and practical ways to do safety differently with you. Your support and curiosity are what make this community so strong, and I want to thank you for being part of it. If you're ready to keep building capability, capacity, and resilience, I'd encourage you to check out the HOP Beginner's Guide series on Amazon. Each volume is short, practical, and packed with insights, and the book series is designed for busy people who want real impact, not theory. This isn't the end of the conversation, just the next step in your journey. So thank you again for listening, for learning, for supporting better work. Until next time, remember, small changes, shared stories, and thoughtful practice lead to big results with HOP, learning teams, and the 4Ds.
We learn that people slip, it's only human. Errors show the path to grow and we're improving. Context shapes the way we do our best work. Focus on the system, no blame can hold us back. 5 HOP principles lifting us higher. Learning without blame, fueling our fire. Together we grow, together we thrive. Keeping operational excellence alive.